It's when surveying all of this, when looking at the megaliths, when looking at the elongated skulls, because remember I mentioned you have to factor these guys in.
Mm-hmm.
When looking at the elongated skulls, when considering the existence of this race of giants, the Nephilim, who existed both in the antediluvian world and in the post-diluvian world, and then also considering another factor here, another piece of the puzzle, the fact that the human species was much more extraordinary in the antediluvian world than we are today. They were in every way superior to us. And it's, of course, in stark contrast to the ridiculous evolutionary narrative, the evolutionary timeline, which depicts as you move backward on the timeline of history, human beings are becoming dumber and dumber and dumber until you get to cavemen, Neanderthals, right? That is the Darwinian perspective of history, and it is absurd. It's evident. It is evident, abundantly clear, that our antecedents were much more were superior to us in every way. They were more physically robust, and they were more and they were much more intellectually robust, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Their intellectual capacity, their capabilities in regard to thought and action were greater than our own, because we are, as I've said many times in many different interviews and in my book, I detail this extensively, we are really, really crappy versions of Adam. And the closer you get to the source, that prototypical human being, the more perfect a specimen you're going to have in regard to the human species. So those people living in the antediluvian world were high caliber human beings, high functioning human beings.
Well,
their
Noah
brains were firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, Noah was even described as being perfect in his generations. Chuck Missler suggested that was down to his genetics, even.
Yeah, so I think that is commentary on the purity of his genetics in comparison to the corruption, the genetic corruption of the rest of the human species at the time, because of the action of the Watchers, because of the transgression of the Watchers and their hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, the giants. So you have all of these things in play from a biblical perspective, by the way. Now there are also other considerations. Was Atlantis real? Were there civilizations that were much more advanced than modern archaeology and than modern archaeology concedes? Were there civilizations, in fact, that were in some ways, to some degree, more advanced than we are? Now, not to say that they were running around with cell phones, with smartphones in their pockets. No, they would have taken a different path of technology.
Sure, physically and intellectually of a much higher caliber.
Yes, and also in regard to their technology, there might have existed, and I believe there did, a civilization that was far superior to the ancient Egyptians and the Sumerians and all of these remarkable ancient cultures that were living in a post-flood context. There might have been let's call it an antediluvian mother civilization that is the origin of those civilizations, and a civilization that was benefiting from the high functioning intellect of the human species, human beings, by the way, who according to the biblical narrative were living hundreds and hundreds of years. Imagine being a master stonemason, studying under a renowned master stonemason and living 500 plus years. How good of a stonemason would you have been by the time you were 500 years old?
Sure.
Right. And and sharing knowledge with the other stonemasons who were also living incredibly long and with higher functioning brains than we have today.
Mhm.
So that's why I'm circling back all the way to this notion that what we're looking at is evil technology, the result of evil technology. I don't think technology is evil. Again, I don't assign attributes to inanimate objects.
And maybe I misspoke. I wasn't suggesting that the technology was evil. Only suggesting that it could have been built by evil hands. Like if
It
we
could
don't,
have been.
yeah,
It could have
we have
it could have
to.
been built by both by the antediluvian
Mhm.
human beings from both the lineage of Adam, of Seth, and of Cain.
Yeah, and that would
Or
all be
maybe-
predicated.
Go ahead.
It would all be predicated upon if say we could definitively say, okay, these structures were 100% made by the Nephilim, the original progenitor Nephilim. Then I suppose we could go out on that limb and say, yes, they were crafted by evil hands. But again, their use and their function and their existence is neutral in itself. But I feel like what you're saying is like,
Well,
we
I
don't
would,
know if they were 100% made by just them or by additional races that were
There's
there
no
as
way to
well.
know if the Nephilim had anything whatsoever to do with the megaliths.
Sure.
Now, I suspect they did,
Same.
but there's no way to know that, and I'm not going to pretend that I do.
Yeah.
But I think we just need to embrace all of the possibilities since we have no evidence.
Mhm.
We have fingerprints of an unknown builder. That's what we have. We have the fingerprints of a master builder. Now, who the identity of that builder is, was it one builder or was it many builders in regard to, was it just this faction or was it this faction plus all these other factions all building with the same kind of technology for different purposes? We cannot know that. We do know that whoever built the megaliths were employing a technique that is today lost to us.
Yeah, for sure.
They were employing a technique that is in many ways far superior to anything we do today. Why? Because their walls were anti-seismic. They took very hard stone, very large stones, like in the case of Saksaywaman, stones that weigh hundreds of tons. And not only did they fit them together so perfectly that you can't fit a butter knife between the joints, in many of the joints, but also they cut them into polygonal shapes, as you can see. It's hard enough to build just a brick wall with rectangles, a good brick wall with rectangles, let alone a megalithic wall devised with massive 100+ ton stones that are cut into these intricate polygonal shapes and fitted together perfectly. That is an engineering feat that rivals anything we can do today, and I would say to some degree surpasses anything we can do today.
I'd have to agree there for sure. Well, you look at L.A. Marzulli did a fantastic series of lectures covering Nephilim architecture, as he called it, fallen angel technology, a lot having to do in Peru. Specifically, he talked about the tower structures, and he talked about the shape of them here. And I watched on a video, you and him both talking when you guys were together in Peru on excavation, and talking about these stones, the way that they're sort of almost kind of like puffed out slightly. Like talking with my mother on this. Yeah. I said, imagine heating up a marshmallow and then squishing it between 2 graham crackers. You have sort of this ballooning out. And you suggested that potentially being because they were laid not in exactly a molten state, but somewhat almost viscous or hot, as if the edges were heated up when they were cut.
Yeah, they have the appearance of having been soft or softened when they were fitted together, but that's just a conjecture. But it's certainly within the realm of possibility based on the mere appearance of the stones. One can observe, as you said, that they have this marshmallow effect to them, where it does look like they were pressed together rather than simply cut. It looks like they were squished together to fit the way that they do. In fact, If you are a careful observer of the megaliths in the city of Cusco, as you walk through the streets in Cusco, you have these megalithic foundations upon which the Spaniards built other kinds of edifices, and the Inca before them. You will notice with some of these stones that on the edge of the stone, where one stone sits on top of another, there's this slight lip that overlaps the stone just slightly. And that does not, to me, it appears that it's that overlap, that lip is created by the pressure of the stone sitting on top, and the fact that stone was perhaps not entirely hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's squished down a little bit, and you would get that little ridge overlapping in the front. You follow me?
Here's a question for you real quick.
Why would someone carve that is the point. Why would someone carve that little ridge that so many of these stones have? That doesn't make any sense to me. It seems to me that they were, as I said, it was the product of pressure. It was because the stones were not entirely hardened when they were set, and they sort of squished a little bit, and you would get that a slight overlap. You'd get that slight lip on the edge where one stone sits on top of the other.
Sure. And that makes a lot of sense. Like, why would you build that feature in? And only because you've been here, you've gotten to see these structures and put your hand on them. Is there any mortar in these joints that you can see?
No, not so this is called Cyclopean architecture. If you want to be technical, rather than Nephilim architecture, although you're very close when you say Cyclopean, because the Cyclopes would certainly have qualified as Nephilim. It's called Cyclopean architecture, technically speaking. It is named so by archaeologists because it derives from Greek mythology. The great master builders in Greek mythology were the Cyclopes, were the hybrid offspring of the gods, who happened to be giants with one eye, right? So they were the great masons and artificers of Greek mythology. And so that term was adopted by archaeologists, Cyclopean. Now, the Cyclopean architecture refers to stones that not necessarily megalithic, but predominantly megalithic. The megalithic sites employ this style, this technique. It refers to stones that are precisely fitted together without the use of any kind of binding material, such as mortar. So this is very difficult to do, because if you don't build a wall really, really well without any kind of binding material, it's going to fall over, especially in an earthquake. And these large Cyclopean walls in Greece and in Peru and other parts of the world, and to some extent in Sardinia, they have withstood enormous convulsions of the earth and have not fallen. They were fit together precisely to withstand in such a way that they would withstand earthquakes. So
now, is that the reason for the odd shapes? Like when we look at Saksaywaman,
that's why they're offset. That's why they're polygonal. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. When you fit these stones together in this erratic fashion, you get a much stronger wall. That wall is going to be much more difficult to tear apart in an earthquake, and it's interlocking, and so those blocks are interlocked with one another, and that creates a very anti-seismic effect, and that is called Cyclopean architecture or Cyclopean masonry. And that is the trademark of these antediluvian builders, Cyclopean masonry. It is their trademark. Now, again, the identity of these antediluvian builders, I just gave you a suite of possibilities.
Sure.
Within which are the Nephilim. And I do subscribe to that. So I don't want people to think I don't. I do believe that in at least some cases, the Nephilim were responsible for building some of these walls, especially the one we're looking at right there, Saksaywaman.
Oh, yeah.
And
I mean, the
point this out all
stone
the
is
time.
huge. Like, I don't see this being brought from 45 miles away from a quarry using the
quarry
log
was 10
rolling.
miles
Or
away,
10 miles,
or
10 miles
10
even.
to 20 miles away from Saksaywaman. But the thing you'll notice when you're at Saksaywaman, which actually differentiates it from some of the other sites in Peru, is the doorways are enormous. The doorways are at least, I would say, the doorways at Saksaywaman would comfortably accommodate a 9 foot to 10 foot tall person.
Sure.
There you have one right there.
Easily.
And I know that because I'm 6'1", and I've stood in that doorway, and they're almost twice my height.
Oh my gosh.
That doorway, both its height and width, would accommodate a 9 to 10 foot tall giant.
With probably a 4 foot girth.
And you can see behind the doorway, you can see the steps leading up into the citadel. And those steps are spaced very far apart. They're not spaced for the gait of an average sized man. Let's assume that and I don't know that this is true, let's assume that those steps were constructed to accommodate a 9 foot tall guy. Well, that would match how far they're spaced. That would match the gait of somebody twice my size. Because normally when you make steps, it's 1 or 2 steps in between each level, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are not devised that way. These are constructed in a very interesting way so that there's large gaps in between each level. Now, maybe that was intentional by the builders, and the builders were just normal sized people, and that's the way they wanted to do it. That's fine. That's reasonable, but maybe not. Maybe the size of the doors and the separation between each step were intentionally devised to accommodate the stature of the builders.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is not common, okay, because you go an hour and a half outside of Cusco to Ollantaytambo, and when you observe those megaliths, and that's a fascinating. In fact, I think that is my favorite megalithic site, Ollantaytambo. You'll find the same kind of doorways, but much smaller. Certainly would not accommodate a 9 foot tall guy, and it's a different scale than Saksaywaman. So you cannot say that, and many of the megaliths, this can be said of them. You can say, for example, that giants built the Pyramid of Giza. Fine. That's I don't necessarily subscribe to that, by the way, that particular construction. You can say that. You can make that claim. That's a plausible hypothesis. But the problem is normal-sized people have to squeeze through some of those passageways inside.
Mm-hmm.
Why in the world would a 10-foot tall, 9-foot tall giant build a complex that he cannot fit in?
Yeah, doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. And if you're going to make that claim, you have to make it make sense. Now, You could say, I suppose, that the giants built it for normal-sized people. Okay, well, that could make sense. But you cannot say that the giants built some of these megalithic sites, such as the Great Pyramids of Giza, to accommodate themselves, for themselves. That is not a logical statement. That doorway, that's at Ollantaytambo. That doorway, I would guess, is probably about 7 foot tall.
Okay.
I would say it's 7 foot tall. And you cannot walk. 2 men cannot stride side by side through that doorway. So you're looking at a different scale here. You have to account for these variations in the megalithic complexes. Those, by the way, are not steps. Those are terraces. The steps, you can see the steps coming through the middle of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a whole nother story there. That's remarkable. Those were built by the Inca, by the way, those terraces. That is an Inca construction. But the megalithic walls of Otetzojantai-Tambo, the megalithic foundations of that site were clearly built by a pre-Inca civilization, because
Sure.
the Inca built on top of them, using an inferior technique.
That is fascinating. Well, and one of the things that I really enjoyed when L.A. Marzulli was covering a lot of these structures in Peru, he talked about the hardness scale of andesite and basalt being somewhere around a 6 or a 7 on the hardness scale, and the tour guides there suggesting that, oh, well, these were cobbled together by the Incans using copper chisels. And LA says, okay, well, I happen to have here a stonemason. Here, you go ahead, take this copper chisel, see what you do with this. And the guy walked up to the stone and he hit it a couple times, like 2 or 3 times, pulled that copper chisel away, and it was totally blunted and completely dulled. He says there's no way that these things were hewn by copper chisels.
Yeah, and I mean, there's some things to be said for that. I doubt, I seriously doubt that these structures, any of these structures around the world, were cut with copper tools.
Yeah,
there are arguments made by archaeologists, by conventional archaeologists, in regard to the way that these tools were hardened and used. So they would say that the hardening of the copper was different than a copper chisel we would make today. So it's not a one-to-one comparison. And then also the utility, the way that they were used, also differed. So be aware that there is some argumentation there in regard to whether or not a copper chisel could have cut these stones. But I agree with L.A. Marzulli. I think it's absurd.
Yeah,
I think it's absurd to certainly to state so emphatically, as Egyptologists and as the archaeologists in Peru do, that these walls were made with copper chisels and stone hammers, and that the stones were cut with ropes and sand and all of these rudimentary techniques, all of these unsophisticated techniques, that it just seems like an absurdity, and I think it is.